They say some men walk into a room already dead. They just don't know it yet. On a warm summer night in Harlem, a hired killer pushed open the doors of a packed restaurant with one goal in mind: kill Bumpy Johnson in front of everyone. He believed fear was loud. He believed size and reputation were enough. What he didn't understand was that Harlem had its own rules, and Bumpy Johnson wrote them. By the end of that night, the hitman would walk out alive, but blind, broken, and erased from power. And the entire neighborhood would never forget what they witnessed. This story doesn't begin with a knife or a fight. It begins with control. In 1935, Harlem was more than a place. It was a prize. The numbers racket was worth millions, and white mob bosses wanted it all. At the center of that storm stood Ellsworth Bumpy Johnson, a quiet, sharply dressed enforcer with a reputation that traveled faster than bullets. He wasn't loud. He wasn't reckless. But when Bumpy made a promise, he kept it. And the promise was simple. Harlem would not be taken. That promise made powerful enemies. One of them was Dutch Schultz, a ruthless crime boss who believed Harlem could be conquered the same way everything else was, through fear and blood. He'd already sent men into the neighborhood. They didn't come back. So Schultz did what desperate men do. He called in someone worse. A professional hitman from out of town. A man known for public killings. A man built to intimidate. The order was clear. Find Bumpy Johnson, make it public, and send a message that Harlem was no longer safe. But what Schultz didn't see was how Harlem worked. The streets talked. Everyone watched. Before the hitman even sat down for dinner, Bumpy already knew his name, his face, and his purpose. And instead of hiding, Bumpy did something unexpected. He went out, dressed sharp, calm, unbothered, like a man who had nothing to fear. That same night, in a famous Harlem restaurant filled with music, conversation, and nearly 200 people, Bumpy sat down for dinner. Not alone. With him was a woman from outside his world. A writer, curious about Harlem, unaware she was about to witness history. The mood was relaxed. Jazz played softly. Plates clinked. No one sensed what was about to happen. Then the door opened. The hitman stepped inside, scanning the room. His eyes landed on Bumpy. They locked. In that moment, everything changed. This wasn't a sneak attack. This wasn't a chase. This was a confrontation, right in the open, with families, musicians, and workers just feet away. And the killer smiled, confident that the room belonged to him now. But confidence can be dangerous when it's misplaced. What happened next would be talked about in Harlem for decades. Not because of how violent it was, but because of how controlled it was, how fast it ended, and how calmly Bumpy Johnson handled what came after. People wouldn't just remember the fight. They would remember what Bumpy did once it was over. They would remember the silence, the stillness, the message. By morning, the story had spread across the city. A hitman came to Harlem to kill Bumpy Johnson and left blinded, defeated, and forgotten. Dutch Schultz heard the story and finally understood something important. Harlem wasn't scared. And Bumpy Johnson wasn't just dangerous. He was untouchable. But here's the part most people don't know. That night wasn't the end. It was the beginning. The moment that changed the balance of power in New York forever. And what Bumpy did next would force the biggest mob bosses in America to sit down and negotiate. That's where this story really begins. In the years leading up to that night, Bumpy Johnson had already learned something most men never do. That power isn't taken in one loud moment. It's built quietly over time. He grew up watching Harlem change hands, watching promises made and broken by men who never planned to stay. Outsiders came for money, never for the people. Bumpy noticed that difference early. To him, Harlem wasn't a business opportunity. It was home, and that made everything personal. By the early 1930s, Harlem's underground economy revolved around the numbers game. It paid rent, fed families, and kept small businesses alive when the rest of the city looked the other way. At the center of it all was Madame Stephanie St. Clair, sharp-minded and fearless, fighting court cases by day and rivals by night. Bumpy became her shield. He didn't run his mouth. He didn't rush. He watched, waited, and acted only when necessary. That restraint is what made him dangerous. Dutch Schultz didn't understand restraint. He understood pressure. He believed if you squeeze hard enough, something always breaks. Harlem, to him, was just another territory, another number on a map. But the harder he pushed, the more resistance he met. His men felt eyes on them, wherever they walked. Deals fell apart. Warnings came without words. Harlem didn't fight loudly. It closed ranks. That's why Schultz chose a hitman. Someone unfamiliar with Harlem's rhythm. Someone who didn't know the faces or the silences. Someone who would walk straight into danger thinking he was a danger. The plan was meant to be simple and terrifying. One public act. One clear outcome. Harlem would fall in line. What no one accounted for was Bumpy's patience. He knew the danger wasn't just to him. It was to everyone around him. A reckless move could turn a crowded room into chaos. And Bumpy refused to let Harlem pay that price. So instead of running, he stayed visible. He kept his routine. He went to clubs, restaurants, meetings, never changing his pace. Not because he didn't care, but because he did. People close to Bumpy would later say that's what made him different. He carried responsibility heavier than fear. Every decision came with weight.
I have the documents.
Every
you
move
requested.
had consequences
Good.
beyond
Let's review them
himself.
now.
Right away.
That night at the restaurant wasn't about pride. It was about preventing something worse. Meanwhile, the hitman moved through Harlem like a stranger wearing confidence. He didn't know who was watching or who was listening. He didn't notice the quiet signals passing from corner to corner. To him, it was just another job, another name, another paycheck waiting at the end. But Harlem already knew the ending. Inside that restaurant, before anything happened, something invisible had already shifted. Conversations softened. The music felt distant. People sensed danger without seeing it. That's the thing about real tension. It doesn't announce itself. It settles into the room and waits. And sitting at that table, Bumpy Johnson felt it too. Not fear, awareness. The night wasn't rushing toward violence. It was circling it, and every second stretched longer than the last. Because when two forces finally meet, one driven by ego, the other by control, the outcome is never accidental. What happened next would define reputations, redraw alliances, and send a message far beyond Harlem. But before the room erupted, before the story became legend, there was one final moment of calm. And that moment mattered more than anyone realized. From across the room, different people sensed the same thing in different ways. The musicians felt it first. Their hands stayed on their instruments, but the rhythm slipped, notes stretching a little too long. The waiter noticed it next, pausing with a tray in his hands, unsure why his chest felt tight. Even the regulars, men who had seen fights before, fell quiet. Harlem knew tension. It lived with it. But this was something heavier, like the air itself was waiting. The hitman stood near the entrance, letting the room take him in. He wanted to be seen. That was part of his reputation. He believed fear worked best when it was public. He believed Bumpy Johnson would look away or flinch or stand too fast. What he saw instead confused him. Bumpy didn't rush, didn't stare him down. He sat there like the night belonged to him, listening, watching, reading the room the way only someone from Harlem could. At the table, the woman sitting across from Bumpy noticed a change in him before anything else. His posture shifted slightly, not tense, just alert, like a man noticing the weather turn. She didn't know the full story, but she could feel it. This wasn't a coincidence. She would later say that what frightened her most wasn't what happened next, but how calm Bumpy looked before it did. Outside the restaurant, Harlem kept moving. Cars passed. Voices echoed down the block. People
I have
laughed.
the documents you requested.
Life went on.
Good. Let's review them
Unaware
now.
that a line
Right
was
away.
about to be crossed inside those walls. That contrast mattered. Because what happened next wasn't just about two men. It was about whether Harlem could protect itself in plain sight. The hitman began walking toward Bumpy's table. Slowly, deliberately. Each step was meant to send a message. This was his stage. He wanted witnesses. He wanted stories told. But as he moved closer, something didn't feel right. The room wasn't shrinking away from him. It wasn't panicking. It was watching him, quiet, focused, almost united. Bumpy noticed that too. In that moment, years of pressure sat on his shoulders. Every threat, every warning, Every man Schultz had sent before this one. Bumpy knew that whatever happened next wouldn't stay between them. It would ripple outward, reaching Dutch Schultz, the police, the streets, and the future Harlem itself. One wrong move could invite chaos. One slow move could invite death. Across the room, the hitman mistook stillness for fear. From the woman's point of view, time slowed. She saw the hitman's eyes flick around the room. She saw Bumpy glance not at him, but at the people nearby. The workers, the musicians, the strangers who didn't deserve to be caught in the middle of a power struggle. That single glance told her something important. This man wasn't thinking about survival alone. He was thinking about responsibility, and that made him unpredictable. What no one else could hear was the quiet war happening inside Bumpy's mind. Fight too early and it looks reckless. Wait too long and others get hurt. Power wasn't about strength in that moment. It was about timing. The hitman stopped just short of the table. Words were about to be exchanged. Choices were about to be locked in. And in that fragile pause between confidence and consequence, Harlem held its breath, unaware that history was standing only inches away from being written. The room had gone silent. Every sound felt amplified. The clink of a glass, the soft rustle of a napkin, even a faint scratch of a pen from a nearby notepad. The hitman's eyes never left Bumpy Johnson. He had been trained for moments like this, taught to strike first, strike fast, and make it count. But the way Bumpy looked at him wasn't fear, and it wasn't surprise. It was something else, calm, sharp, and unshakable. That quiet confidence was unnerving. It made the air feel heavier, as if the space between them had become its own battlefield. Bumpy's hand rested lightly on the table, near his knife. Not in a gesture of threat, but of readiness. A subtle signal only someone who understood violence and control could recognize. The hitman's lips curled into a smirk. Thinking he had the upper hand, he believed size and aggression would win the moment he made the first move. But what he didn't know was how Bumpy had already calculated every possibility, every angle, every escape, every response. Years in Harlem had taught him that precision mattered more than power. Patience was a weapon as sharp as any knife. The jazz quartet tried to keep playing, but their fingers faltered. Notes hung in the air like suspended tension. Patrons held their breath, sensing the inevitability of what was coming. Some clutched each other. Others pressed their faces against the wall, hoping to make themselves invisible. Harlem had witnessed violence before, but never like this. The difference was in the way Bumpy carried it. Like it was a puzzle, and he had already solved it. The hitman stepped closer, and now the distance between predator and target shrank to mere feet. He whispered words meant to intimidate, meant to remind Bumpy that death was close, meant to unsettle the calm before the storm. "Bumpy Johnson," he said, his voice loud enough for nearby tables to hear. "Dutch Schultz sent me. He says your time is up." Bumpy's gaze didn't waver. His voice was low, measured, carrying both authority and warning. "Tell Schultz," he said quietly. "Harlem already solved that problem. He just doesn't know it yet." The words hung in the air, almost audibly slicing through tension. It wasn't arrogance. It was certainty. And certainty can be terrifying. Every patron in the restaurant felt it. The rhythm of the night had changed. Fear wasn't screaming here. Fear was stillness. Fear was understanding that something monumental was about to happen, and no one could stop it. The hitman adjusted his stance, hand brushing against his pistol. He wanted to act, to show dominance, to finish the job before hesitation could weaken him. But he paused, sensing the invisible line that Bumpy had drawn. Every muscle, every move, every angle had already been considered by the man sitting calmly at the table. Even the woman across from Bumpy could feel the tension, like a weight pressing down on her chest. Her eyes darted between the two men, understanding more with each passing second. She realized this wasn't just a fight over money or territory. It was a clash of control, of intellect, of presence. The outcome wouldn't just determine who walked out alive. It would define power in Harlem for years to come. The hitman's smirk faltered for the first time. The calm in Bumpy's eyes was disorienting. For a split second, Everything slowed. Every heartbeat, every breath, every thought felt magnified. This was the moment where the scales would tip. This was a pause before history unfolded, where anticipation, fear, and strategy collided. And in that silence, everyone in the room knew the storm was about to break. But no one could guess how violently or precisely it would strike. The pause stretched longer than it should have. Long enough for doubt to creep in. Long enough for the hitman to realize something was off. Harlem wasn't reacting the way other places did. No one screamed. No one rushed the door. Instead, I stayed fixed, steady, almost judging. It felt less like a crowd and more like a jury. And that's when the hitman noticed something he hadn't before. How many people in the room were watching him? Not Bumpy. Then came the first twist. Near the bar, a man quietly stood up. He wasn't large. He wasn't threatening. He looked like an ordinary customer finishing a drink, but his eyes were sharp, and he never once looked at the hitman. He looked past him, toward the door. Another man near the wall did the same. Subtle, almost invisible. To most people, it meant nothing. To Bumpy, it meant everything. Dutch Schultz hadn't sent just one man. The realization didn't panic Bumpy. It confirmed what he already suspected. Schultz never trusted a single move. He believed in pressure from all sides. A main threat to draw attention, and shadows to close in if things went wrong. That was how Schultz operated. And now, inside this crowded Harlem restaurant, that strategy was about to put innocent people in danger. The hitman in front of Bumpy still believed this was his moment. His fingers brushed his coat again, confidence returning. He thought he was in control. What he didn't know was that Bumpy had already shifted the game. This wasn't just about surviving anymore. It was about stopping what came next. Across the table, the woman sensed something change. Not louder, not faster, heavier. Bumpy's calm hadn't broken, but it had sharpened. His eyes moved now, not just on the man standing over him, but across the room, reading faces, counting steps, tracking exits. She realized then that this wasn't a reaction. It was preparation. Outside, a police siren echoed faintly down the avenue. Not close enough to help. Not far enough to ignore. Another layer of pressure. Another clock ticking. The hitman leaned in slightly, lowering his voice. "You think you're untouchable," he said. "Men like you always do." His words were meant to provoke, to force a mistake. But Bumpy didn't rise to it. He didn't argue. He didn't threaten. He simply looked up at him and said, "This isn't your room." That sentence landed harder than any insult, because the hitman suddenly understood. He wasn't feared here. He was exposed. The room felt tighter now. The music had fully stopped. Chairs scraped softly as people shifted, unsure whether to run or freeze. The two men near the bar hadn't moved again, but their presence hung in the air like unanswered questions. How many more were there? How far was Schultz willing to go tonight? Bumpy's hand moved slightly on the table. Not fast, not obvious, just enough to signal that the waiting was almost over. Whatever happened next would happen quickly, decisively, and it wouldn't stay contained. The hitman's jaw tightened. His plan was slipping and he could feel it. He had walked in expecting fear. Instead, he found resistance layered with intelligence. And in that moment, standing in the heart of Harlem, he realized the job was bigger than he'd been told. The balance was about to break. And when it did, nothing about Harlem's power structure would ever be the same. By the next morning, Harlem felt different. The streets were the same, the shops open like always, and the music still poured out of open windows. But something had shifted underneath it all. People spoke in lower voices, not out of fear, but recognition. A line had been drawn, and everyone knew who had drawn it. The story moved fast, passed from barbershops to churches, from numbers runners to taxi drivers. A hitman came to Harlem to kill Bumpy Johnson, and Harlem watched him fail. For the people who lived there, the meaning was clear. This wasn't just about one man surviving an attack. It was about the neighborhood proving it couldn't be bullied from the outside. Harlem had been exploited for years, its money drained, its people ignored. Bumpy Johnson didn't change that overnight, but he showed something powerful. That respect could be enforced without turning Harlem into a war zone. Control, not chaos, was the message. Dutch Schultz felt that message more clearly than anyone. He had built his reputation on pressure and fear, but Harlem didn't bend the way other places did. The cost had grown too high. Too many men lost. Too much attention. Schultz was smart enough to know when brute force stopped working. Backing off wasn't weakness. It was survival. And so, quietly, he changed course. That decision would shape the rest of Bumpy Johnson's life. Instead of being hunted, he became someone others wanted to negotiate with. Not because he was the loudest or the most violent, but because he was reliable. Deals made with Bumpy stuck. Lines drawn by him stayed in place. Even rival crime bosses began to understand that Harlem operated differently, and Bumpy Johnson was the reason why. The hitman himself faded from the story almost as quickly as he entered it. Some said he was sent back to Chicago in disgrace. Others believed Schultz made sure he never spoke about that night again. The truth never mattered much. In Harlem, he was already gone. A name without weight. A warning, not a legend. The woman who had been sitting across from Bumpy that night carried a memory with her long after she left Harlem. She would go on to write about art, music, and culture, but she never published the full story of what she witnessed. Friends said she couldn't find the right words. How do you explain a man who could discuss poetry one moment and command a room the next? How do you describe power that doesn't raise its voice? Bumpy returned to his routine. He walked the streets, checked in on businesses, made sure numbers runners were protected, and kept order where the city failed to. He wasn't perfect, and he wasn't gentle, but he was consistent. That consistency mattered. Families slept easier knowing that violence wouldn't spill randomly into their lives. In a world where chaos was common, predictability felt like safety. Years later, Bumpy Johnson would face prison betrayal and shifting alliances. He would sit across from some of the most powerful crime figures in America and be treated as an equal, not because of his size or his temper, but because his word carried weight. The foundation for that reputation was laid on nights like the one in that Harlem restaurant. People often asked what made Bumpy different from other gangsters. Some said it was intelligence. Others said it was loyalty. But those who understood Harlem best said it was something simpler. He never forgot where he was. He never forgot who was watching. Every move he made considered the people around him, not just the outcome for himself. That awareness turned moments of danger into moments of control. The story of that night grew over time. Details blurred, some exaggerated, some softened, but one part never changed. After it was over, after the danger had passed, Bumpy sat down like the night still belonged to him. That image stuck because it captured the truth of who he was. Not a man driven by impulse, but by certainty. Harlem remembered that lesson. Outsiders learned it too. You could bring muscle, money, and threats into neighborhood, but none of that guaranteed power. Power came from understanding the place, respecting its people, and knowing when not to act. Bumpy Johnson embodied that balance. And that's why his name carried meaning long after others were forgotten. In later years, old-timers would tell the story to younger generations, not to glorify violence, but to explain survival. They'd say Harlem wasn't protected by luck or fear. It was protected by men who understood consequences, by men who knew that every action echoed far beyond the moment it happened. That night didn't just end a threat. It ended an idea. The idea that Harlem was easy to take, easy to scare, easy to control from the outside. After that, negotiations replaced invasions. Conversations replaced ambushes. And while the streets were never free of struggle, they were no longer open hunting grounds. Bumpy Johnson never called himself a hero, and Harlem never needed him to. He was a product of his time and his environment, shaped by pressure and responsibility. But in a city that often erased black power, he forced it to be acknowledged, not through speeches or headlines, but through presence. The lesson of that night still lingers. Real power doesn't announce itself. It doesn't rush. It waits, watches, and acts only when it must. Anyone can create fear for a moment. Few can create order that lasts. And that's why, decades later, people still talk about Bumpy Johnson, not just as a gangster, not just as a legend, but as the man who showed that in Harlem, respect wasn't demanded, It was earned.